Sometimes Love is Under Your Foot by Colin, Thompson. The blurb. Kevin the dog loves his owner Brian so much he thinks that Brian is God. But Brian usually ignores Kevin, except when he nearly treads on him in his big shoes. When Brian becomes ill, he learns to appreciate the love that has been there all along. Brian was a man who went through life in big shoes. He had a wife and 2 children and Kevin. Brian loved his wife and 2 children, but he never told them. Big, grown-up men don't do that sort of thing. His wife and children loved him back, but they never told him either. They all knew they loved each other, so they thought they didn't need to say it. Kevin loved Brian so hard that he thought Brian was God. Every day when Brian came home from work, Kevin was the first to greet him. He would look up at him with his eyes full of love and wag his tail. Brian usually ignored Kevin, except when he nearly trod on him in his big shoes. Then Kevin would put his tail between his legs and curl up in his basket. The children liked Kevin, and Kevin liked them. They would take each other for walks and play on the beach. But it wasn't true love, not like Kevin felt for Brian. At night, when everyone was asleep, Kevin would lie in his basket and dream about Brian. He would dream the 2 of them were running across a big field of chasing a red ball. But his favourite dream was being curled up on Brian's lap watching soccer on TV. All Brian would say was, "I think that dog should sleep outside." Then Brian got ill. He lay in bed for 3 weeks. Kevin, who wasn't allowed upstairs, didn't see or hear him. Brian's wife was so busy looking after him that one day she forgot to give Kevin any dinner. Kevin didn't mind. He knew Brian was much more important than he was, and anyway, he found an old crust and some chips under the lounge. One night, Kevin was lying in bed, trying desperately not to forget what Brian looked like, when Brian came downstairs. It was the middle of the night and the whole world was asleep. Brian went over to Kevin's basket and picked him up. It was the first time he had ever touched Kevin, apart from standing on his tail once a week. He carried the little dog over to the lounge and sat down with him on his lap. Kevin had to blink 17 times to make sure it wasn't all a dream. Maybe, Kevin thought, maybe he's going to turn on the TV and we're going to watch soccer. But Brian just sat looking out at the moon. He looked very old and very ill. Kevin curled up in Brian's big hands and tried to be as warm as he could to make Brian better. After a while, Brian sighed. It was a sigh that Kevin knew all about, a weary, lonely sigh, and Kevin could feel it go right through him. Brian stood up and went over to Kevin's basket, but instead of putting him down, he turned and carried him upstairs. He climbed into bed beside his wife and tucked Kevin in between them. Kevin wished Brian had put him out for a puddle first, but he held on all night, worried that if he moved a muscle, it would turn out to be a dream and he would be back on his own downstairs. "What's Kevin doing here?" said Brian's wife in the morning. "Who?" said Brian. "Kevin, the dog." "Come on, dog, you know you're not allowed upstairs," said Brian's wife, and she took Kevin down to the garden, which was just as well, as Kevin didn't think he could have held on much longer. The next night, Brian crept down and got Kevin again, and every night for the rest of the week, by which time Brian's wife realised what was going on. After that, Kevin was allowed upstairs whenever he liked. When Brian was better and back at work, Kevin would rush out to greet him before everyone else. Brian always leant down, patted him and said hello and made sure he didn't stand on Kevin's tail. He never told Kevin he loved him, because big grown-up men don't do that sort of thing. But Kevin knew anyway. And that's the end.